Hello, I'm Manueltos, and today I'm going to talk about the Trump versus DeSantis controversy, as well as what many people are saying is a decline in the Trump coalition. So I'm going to explain some of the historical background of that and why it matters for the Republican Party as well as for the conservative movement. The current events aren't things that simply arose within the past few years. I think that they have a deeper historical root that I believe a lot of people are overlooking. Something that goes a lot deeper to the emergence of today's American conservative movement, as well as the history of the Republican Party, as well as the country as a whole. So let's rewind time to the 1920s, almost 100 years ago. If you're looking at the time frame I'm starting with, which is the presidency of Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge is, by many American conservatives, especially in the paleoconservative camp, considered to be one of the best presidents of the 20th century for his policies, which were relatively non interventionist concerning the economy. And he is notable for presiding for the lion's share of what is generally considered to be the Roaring Twenties. Now, after Calvin Coolidge eventually left office, a new president came in, and that was Herbert Hoover. And quickly within Hoover's presidency, things went downhill. Some of these things can be attributed to mismanagement of Hoover's administration, others to certain economic trends within the United States, and others to the status of the international market. But essentially, what ended up happening is a general collapse in the stock market and in banking, leading to what is referred to as the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression isn't simply an economic event, as many people look at it. Many people look at it from the economic angle, from the human angle, but it also had a huge impact on politics, in that it is notable that following the rise to power of the Democrats during the Great Depression time period, the Republicans were out of power. That is to say, not in the sense that they didn't hold any positions of power or couldn't get the presidency, but they had a minority in the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives is the House that generally manages the budget of the United States. They had a minority in there for 40 years straight. And that is, in no uncertain terms, one of the weakest periods for the Republican Party. It's comparable to the Democrats during the Reconstruction. That's how poorly the Republicans were performing in that time period. However, that doesn't mean that the Republicans didn't make it into power at all, because they did manage to gain majorities in the Senate and even win presidential races during this time period, despite being the less popular party overall when it concerns representation. And a lot of this had to do with the way that politics changed because of the Great Depression. And that can mainly be attributed to the administration of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, uh, who had to deal with the consequences of the Great Depression and rebuilding America's economy, and also rebuilding the way that the American economy should work after the war. And this had to do with implementing a number of things such as Social Security. And for a time, there was even the NRA, the National Recovery Agency, which tried to standardize prices in various areas. And some people would even say that some policies implemented in this time period were borderline fascist, not from a social, but from an economic perspective. But anyway, the point is that America moved away from a more free market approach that had characterized the Coolidge administration to a more regulated economic approach that was embraced not only by the Democratic Party, which was the main party behind implementing this new approach to the American economy, but also by the Republican Party in what can be called the New Deal coalition. That is to say that FDR put together a coalition not only of supportive Democrats, but also of many Republicans. And this is later reflected in the character of the economic policies of Republican presidents during this time period. People like Eisenhower, who followed Truman, and Richard Nixon, all supported similar reforms relating to social welfare, to things similar to that that was being done by the Democrats at the time, such as the New Deal, the Square Deal, the Great Society. The Republicans at this time period were implementing their own version of these policies. However, that is not to say that a more economically liberal perspective, that is to say, liberal not in a sense that many Americans like to use the term to refer to generally left-wing policies, but liberal in the sense of freedom, free market, if we're talking about economics. That doesn't mean that that perspective did not continue to exist in certain elements, especially with the rise of more Austrian school economists, combined with new politicians that were championing those ideas, and also looking back positively to the events of Coolidge's presidency. So this led to the rise of what is generally referred to as the American conservative movement, which is ideologically composed of a type of fusionism, that is a fusion between two different ideas. And this fusion is a fusion between these economically liberal policies leading into the Austrian interpretation of the economy, combined with many more what would be referred to socially conservative policies, more rooted in traditional and fundamentalist, maybe not fundamentalist, but foundational religious beliefs that a lot of people had in the country at the time, although those have diverged in a number of different ways, sometimes looking back towards a revisionism, sometimes really trying to understand, going back to the roots of a movement. There's many different ways that people look at what socially conservative policies are, is what I'm trying to say. But anyway, these two movements, this economic movement and this movement on social policy, merged into the American conservative movement, which is referred to more specifically as fusionism. Although, if you really wanted to pick dates on this one, you can go back earlier in time and talk about earlier types of conservatives. And there's also people that look more towards the Constitution, and so constitutionalism and a more strict reading of the Constitution began also becoming more popular in this time period. And you're wondering what this time period is. This is the 60s and 70s, coming out of the 50s, the 60s and 70s, where there's beginning to be an undercurrent of people who are opposing the New Deal consensus that had occurred between the Republicans and Democrats. in the previous decades, the 30s, 40s, and 50s. This movement eventually found its voice in a new politician, and that is Barry Goldwater, who ran for president, initially hoping to run against JFK for his reelection, but eventually instead ending up running against LBJ because of the assassination of JFK. And Barry Goldwater championed states' rights, a number of more liberal, that is to say, economically liberal or Austrian economic policies, and some of his views were more controversial because he took a less, you could say, fearful view of nuclear weapons, which, of course, was unfortunately exaggerated by his opponents to the extreme. And another controversy that plagued his run for president was his opposition to the Great Civil Rights Act that was coming through at the time, even though he had actually supported previous civil rights acts. And the reason why he was opposing the main Civil Rights Act was because he believed that the laws against discrimination were going too far when they were applying to private individuals and private businesses, believing that it should be the right of private persons and businesses to choose to freely associate or disassociate. Another important element in his viewpoint is a more individualistic perspective, as opposed to, let's say, a perspective that's focused on collectivism or on hierarchy. Although Goldwater didn't reject political hierarchies in the same way that, let's say, libertarians or anarchists do. So he certainly did not go to that extent. However, he did not win, but his movement became a prominent enough undercurrent to slowly gain traction over time in the Republican Party. And also, it's in some indirect way also helped grow the future libertarian movement, which ended up adopting some of his ideas. A good way to understand Goldwater's ideas is by reading his book, The Conscience of a Conservative. I also have made some commentary on his work in my book, A Manifesto for American Conservatives. But anyway, moving on from there, eventually the Republican Party ended up having another crisis, and that was the Watergate controversy and the subsequent unpopularity and the dip in Republican popularity following the presidency of Nixon and Ford, leading to the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Now, the problem was that at the same time, the Democrats had a problem of their own, and that was the rising fuel costs during the presidency of Jimmy Carter, which led to essentially a situation where both parties had to somewhat reinvent themselves because they both had become unpopular to some degree. This led to the opportunity of a political realignment. And this political realignment would manifest itself in what is referred to as the Reagan coalition. So Ronald Reagan, who had previously been a campaign staffer for Barry Goldwater and also was an admirer of Calvin Coolidge, ended up becoming the president of the United States in the 80s. And his presidency was, at least by conservatives, considered relatively successful and also led to the mainstream adoption of Goldwater's conservatism as the main face of the Republican movement. Now, of course, a number of things would change as this eventually, this movement moved on, as a lot more religious influences became stronger within the movement compared to at the time of Goldwater, when that was a more secondary element within the movement. However, in order for these conservatives to get into power, they had to build a broad coalition. And this led to a situation where a number of Democrats ended up switching sides to the Republicans, and also the absorption of older members of Republican administrations, such as George H.W. Bush, who ended up becoming Reagan's vice president. And these older elements of the Republicans combined with the Democratic newcomers, both of which had come out of the New Deal coalition, ended up becoming a somewhat moderating faction against the stronger elements of, let's say, the economically liberal, the religiously positive side of the conservative movement. This eventually led to a split within the movement that slowly emerged, and you could argue it was inevitable, but it eventually began to really emerge after Reagan's presidency had ended. Now, of course, the Reagan coalition did not reach its peak in popularity until after Reagan's presidency, during Clinton's presidency, when the Republicans, for the first time in 40 years, ended up having a majority in the House of Representatives. But the split that was occurring at this time period is eventually characterized by the terminology neoconservatives and paleoconservatives, or neocons and paleocons, where the neoconservatives eventually ended up becoming the party, the side within the Republican Party that favored more cooperation with democratic elements, as the Democrats became more progressive over time, and that eventually accelerated during the Obama administration and the Trump administration. But this the neocons were more accepting of a lot of these positions that opposed the more culturally conservative values of the paleoconservatives, or old conservatives, being old not because of their association with older administrations, but more with their association with older movements, looking back to the status quo of Reagan, looking back to people like Goldwater and Coolidge, or sometimes even taking inspiration from the founding fathers or Abraham Lincoln. And the neoconservatives generally being seen as newcomers from the Democratic Party, but also having been mixed with members of older Republican administrations. However, by this time period, a lot of those people were retiring, as of course, unfortunately, people don't live forever, so they can't stay in politics forever, and they eventually need to be replaced. But as this was going on, under the Bush administration, the neoconservatives ended up coming to dominance within the Republican Party. And therefore, from that point onward, began to be referred to as the establishment within the Republican Party. Now, some other distinctions between the neoconservatives and the paleoconservatives, besides their economic and social ideals, is that the neoconservatives were a lot more aggressive when it concerned foreign policy, pursuing more positions of global leadership, which isn't something that didn't exist under Reagan, but was something that was not as actively pursued and to the same extent, wherein Reagan lived during the time period, as well as Nixon, they lived during the time period of the Cold War. So their actions were seen, generally speaking, as that is to say, their interventions, their political interventions, were seen as reactions against an opposing great power, that is to say, against the Soviet Union. Later on, the actions post-Cold War tended to be, until recently, be seen as actions against particular dictators who had been cruel or who were menacing the international order, rather than things that typically directly concerned the security of the United States or its alliance system. That is not to say that they could not be portrayed in such a way as, for example, 9/11 was leveraged to a much greater extent than corresponded to the threat of certain groups that were pigeonholed into associations with 9/11 that may not have actually been associated. And the events of 9/11 as a cultural event really changed or really solidified the power of this more interventionist neoconservative movement, where a lot of the more strongly interventionist policies of the Bush and Obama administrations can be seen as a reaction to the fear that 9/11 caused. Well, with most people focusing on the attack on the World Trade Center, when arguably the greater attack at the time was the damage to the Pentagon. But that's more mincing words there. However, these movements came to a forefront during the Obama administration. That is to say, the split between the neoconservatives and the paleoconservatives really came to the forefront during the Obama administration, when the neoconservatives and the paleoconservatives were competing for political gains during the latter parts of Obama's administration, when the Democratic Party began to drop in popularity and the Republicans began to surge in popularity due to various controversies that were occurring at the time, as well as exhaustion towards certain policies that were happening and the emergence of the culture war at the time, which really began feeding into the culturally conservative position that began to become more popular among certain groups. And therefore, the 2016 election, for many, was seen as the battleground where this would be decided. Particularly, the Republican presidential primary would be the deciding moment where the neocon party establishment would have to face the paleocon challengers who wanted to have less government intervention, more small government type policies, and less foreign wars, among other things. So the stage was set for what would become one of the most important Republican presidential primaries in recent history. However, something unexpected happened. So, of course, the neoconservatives had their favorite candidate, Jeb Bush, who ended up, unfortunately for them, underperforming, eventually having been replaced in that role by John Kasich, who managed to stay in the presidential race for longer. The paleoconservatives had a number of different candidates, most prominently Ted Cruz and Rand Paul, with Ted Cruz by many being seen as by many paleoconservatives being seen as the obvious choice for president. However, a new third position within the Republican Party emerged. And this position was, or more, I wouldn't say it should be called a position, more as a third movement within the Republican Party. And this was that of Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump, the way he managed to become the front runner of a Republican primary is relatively strange, in that he typically said a lot of different things on the campaign trail, many of which were contradictory, which led to many analysts viewing Trump as someone who simply said what he thought people wanted to hear in order to get people to vote for him. And that is the less charitable interpretation. The more charitable interpretation would be that his views developed on the campaign trail, which is, I would say, traditionally speaking, not a good sign, but many people were okay with it at the time. That is to say, many of his supporters were okay with it. Trump did end up facing strong opposition from both the neoconservatives and the paleoconservatives. However, he managed to gain a majority largely because of media exposure, because Trump was willing to say things that were perhaps more uncouth and things that other political candidates were not willing to say, or if they would be willing to say it, would not have said it because it would go against their values. However, these statements managed to get Trump a lot of media attention, and also the indirect support of the Democratic Party, because Trump, of all candidates in the Republican primary, was considered to be one of the ones that polled the worst against the Democrats' candidate Hillary Clinton, which meant that the Democrats saw Trump as their easiest shot of victory, or in some cases, you might say, their only shot for victory, considering that many analysts considered the election to be one where the Republicans would likely win already, even before having picked a particular candidate, just on the basis of the popularity of the two parties at the time. Therefore, the popularity of Trump seemed to many conservatives to be something that was relatively dangerous, because it not only was that Trump was an outsider, not in the sense of an outsider of the establishment, but an outsider to the establishment neoconservatives, as well as the paleoconservatives, who had for a time been the main anti-establishment voice, which meant that Trump's rise would essentially lose power to both sides of a Republican Party, but also because Trump's political positions at the time were difficult to ascertain to many more ideologically minded conservatives, who had a hard time understanding what Trump's political positions would actually be once he would be in power, especially when he did not hold office previously, by which one would be able to have at least some understanding of why this should work. And the reason why I'm talking so long about this is because all of these different issues had an important role in deciding what would happen next. And what happened next is that uh, Trump essentially managed to gain a lot of grassroots support, some of it being genuine support from a lot of people who sought him out for the things he was saying, and some of it was, you could say, astroturfed by the media due to large media exposure. Nevertheless, Trump ended up winning the Republican primary, and this led to a strange situation where a number of prominent neoconservative voices said that they would actually vote for Hillary Clinton over Trump because they did not trust that Trump would be able to run the country well, and because they thought that some of the things Trump was saying were too controversial. Now, that being said, I will say that a lot of the things Trump was saying were actually taken out of context and would not sound as extreme in their proper context. That being said, it is a problem if a politician is not able to correctly contextualize his statements. Nevertheless, at the same time, a number of prominent paleoconservatives also said that they would not vote for Trump, and said that they would instead vote for either third-party candidates that were more conservative. An example would be Darrell Castle, who was running as the Constitution Party candidate at the time, or they would abstain. And ultimately, Trump managed to win the overall election. However, his win ended up being a bit of a bittersweet win because he only won the electoral vote and actually lost the popular vote, which was somewhat a bad sign for things to come. However, people had confidence that if his administration was good, he would be able to have a better performance in his reelection, as many presidents did. Nevertheless, he ended up making many enemies during the election. The Democrats portrayed him as someone that was too extreme, and after his victory, they began pushing a narrative that he had been secretly working with Russian agents in order to defame Hillary Clinton or in some other way cheat in the election. At the same time, Donald Trump's harsh criticisms against the paleoconservative frontrunner Ted Cruz ended up putting him in a situation where a lot of the paleoconservatives were very skeptical of his role as a leader, especially as his capabilities of furthering their policies. Although Trump had embraced a number of paleoconservative policies during his run for president, he also made a number of compromises to the neoconservatives as well. For example, his position on Obamacare, but I will get into that later. At the same time, he also made some enemies among the neoconservative establishment who saw him as an opponent. So Trump was faced with a situation where, although he had a lot of popular support, practically almost everyone who was in office saw him as a threat to some extent. But he managed to pull together a coalition of his own supporters, who might be called the Trumpists, as well as neocons and paleocons, bringing in a lot of politicians from the old establishment into his movement, while also expanding the influence of paleoconservatives and attempting to reconcile with them, especially Ted Cruz, who, though he had maligned him, and some would say even slandered him and libeled him in the election, he tried to collaborate with him and to work with him in order to produce an effective government. However, things did not go smoothly for Trump because, of course, he was faced with a large amount of opposition from the Democratic Party, which from almost the beginning of his administration was attempting to pull him out of office. He was also faced with many problems within the federal departments of old politicians continuing previous policies from the Obama administration and the Bush administration. That is where he describes the deep state, that is to say, bureaucrats who had been in power for a while. And at the same time, a number of his policies began rubbing the wrong way against paleoconservatives. So one example is the whole Obamacare issue. So Barack Obama had passed the Affordable Care Act, a national healthcare act, which attempted to bring healthcare to all Americans to various extents. And this was accomplished in a number of different ways by establishing a marketplace which would allow individuals and families to find affordable care, which would then be subsidized by the government, and also by establishing a healthcare mandate, which meant that anyone who did not have healthcare would be penalized by the government. This penalty was originally challenged by individuals saying that it was wrong to charge someone for not purchasing something. However, the provision was upheld because it was classified as a tax instead of a fine. And as someone who himself has worked with taxes, I must say it, in the recent years, has been one of the most frustrating things to work on, not because of from my perspective as someone who has done people's taxes, but as from the perspective of people who need to have their taxes done, and they have to deal with a situation where they could potentially owe the government money because they're poor, or because they didn't interact with a certain element of the governmental bureaucracy. So typically, I would say that in my experience, the Affordable Care Act, at least the healthcare mandate portion of it, has had a negative impact on taxpayers. That is to say, lower income taxpayers, as higher income taxpayers never really had to worry about those provisions. Nevertheless, this led to a situation where the general paleoconservative position, championed by people like Ted Cruz and Rand Paul in the 2016 election, was to fully repeal the Affordable Care Act. However, Trump's position ended up being a position of repealing and replacing it, which many paleoconservatives considered too moderate. Nevertheless, this plan eventually went forward in the House of Representatives with the American Health Care Act of 2017. However, this act initially found a lot of opposition from this paleoconservative faction, because in 2015, a movement had begun among the congressional Republicans, that is the Freedom Caucus, and this movement was generally opposed to such positions that they considered to be too moderate or too left-leaning. And this led to a situation where Donald Trump ended up coming into opposition with a number of Republicans who had been established in the House already. So one of these Republicans during this time was Congressman Ron DeSantis, who had entered Congress in 2013 and in 2015 had become one of the founders of the Freedom Caucus. Therefore, having at the time been considered to be one of the main anti-establishment movements, and he had been a founder of such a movement. And his opposition to the bill amounted to actually somewhat of a compromise, being willing to support some of its provisions, however, opposing it because from his perspective, the bill did not deal enough with reducing the bureaucracy that the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare had established, and therefore the American Health Care Act, or Trump Care as people were calling it, was in many ways simply replacing one system with another without making significant enough reforms to reduce excessive bloat in the system. Because as Obamacare was coming out, there were a number of problems with its implementation, which had caused a number of additional problems besides the general problems that people were having due to the healthcare mandate itself. So this led Donald Trump to call for the primarying of members of the Freedom Caucus. Essentially, this was a situation where Donald Trump ended up having to team up with the more neocon establishment against the paleoconservative position. However, as time went on, tensions calmed and Trump made a reapproachment with the Freedom Caucus, which led to them granting more support to him. And he managed to maintain his coalition and managed to keep the paleoconservatives within his coalition, who had previously, in some ways, threatened to splinter off due to various issues. Nevertheless, he did not find the end of his troubles there. Because although many prominent neoconservatives had become part of Trump's administration, they still did not support him, and his movement compromising towards the paleoconservatives in a number of different ways alienated the neoconservatives, especially once Trump's own movement, the Trumpists began to, or the populists began to emerge as a movement with a strength of their own. And this came to a head in the 2018 election, in which the Republicans did not perform as well as they would have wanted. And this led to an exacerbation of tensions within Trump's coalition and the beginning of its decline, as a number of neoconservatives ended up beginning to openly oppose Trump because they believed that it was very likely that Trump would not win the 2020 election, and therefore opposing Trump at that time was considered a position for them that could gain them advantages. At the same time, a number of paleoconservatives uh, doubled down on Donald Trump, hoping that Trump's presidency would eventually transition to more conservative policies, especially now that a number of the neoconservatives were beginning to oppose Trump, therefore hoping to essentially move Trump more towards the political right in a number of policies. However, at the same time, the Democrats were intensifying their attacks against Trump, and this situation eventually escalated into the 2020 election. In the 2020 election, the Republicans suffered some major losses. The most prominent one being that Trump lost his re-election. I will go into more details in a minute. Another prominent loss was that the Republicans had lost the House of Representatives, and that there was an even split in the Senate, although due to the Democrats' majority, it meant in the presidential election, it meant that Vice President Kamala Harris was able to break any ties, and also the willingness of a number of neoconservatives to work together with the Democrats on bipartisan issues meant that the Republicans, that is to say, the Trump coalition, led by the rest of the neoconservatives, as well as the Trumpists and the paleoconservatives, would decline in its influence, as the Democrats essentially had the ability to propose a wide range of policies. However, the Democrats, despite being very bold initially, were careful because they were fearful that excessive change in the Congress of 2021 and 2022 would lead to an excessive Republican reaction in the 2022 election, therefore losing the Democrats the Congress of 2023 and 2024, which is why a lot of the more progressive policies were not put forward as much. That is not to say that the Democrats uniformly advocated for these policies, as there were still many blue dogs, as well as more older corporatist elements in the Democratic Party, which were less willing to adopt a lot of the more progressive policies, other than maybe making token gestures in order to remain popular. Nevertheless, Trump's loss in 2020 also posed new problems for the Republican Party, and that was namely the controversy of cheating in the 2020 election, which, for the sake of this video, I will not go too deep into, but the popularity of this proposition that cheating had occurred eventually led to a strong resentment, most strongly among the Trumpists, who were the strongest adopters of this position, even though this position was also viewed very favorably, that not favorably in the sense of agreement, not in the sense of that it was a good thing. This position was also viewed favorably by many of the paleoconservatives and a major faction of the neoconservatives, although it was expressly denied by many neoconservatives. And in the short term, many paleoconservatives considered it something that merited a more careful and thoughtful approach, whereas many of the Trumpists were very vocal about the issue and wanted a popular reaction against it. That is to say that the paleoconservatives were attempting to resolve the issue and conduct investigations and lawsuits from a perspective of doing everything by the book and trying to fix everything that way, whereas the Trumpists were looking for more of a position of popular pressure to accelerate the resolution to this problem, hoping that ideally the problem would be resolved before the count of the electoral votes, so that there could be an easier chance of Trump returning to office, as they believed was the correct course of action following the election. Nevertheless, despite what many of the Democrats were saying and are saying now, I do not believe that it was the intention of anyone in political leadership to, that is to say, there was no concerted effort among the Republican leadership or even among the Trumpist faction to have a violent event or an event that intruded heavily into illegally into the Capitol, which ended up occurring. So it is generally my perspective that the cause for the riot in January 6th, that there was more than one cause. One of it would certainly be the elevated tension in the crowd. I do not believe that Trump was trying to incite stochastic terrorism, although there were certainly some members of the crowd that were, and I do believe that those people need to be held accountable. Another thing to take into account is crowd psychology. People were probably entering because other people were entering. That doesn't make it right that they entered, of course. Let me be very clear on that. And I have criticized people who have entered. And of course, one of my friends had entered because of journalistic curiosity rather than any violent intention. Nevertheless, there was a strong reaction politically against this, with these events being condemned by prominent members of course, the Democrats condemned it because they used it also as a way to attempt to defame Trump. But it was also condemned by the neoconservatives, by the paleoconservatives, and most of the Trumpists. However, during this time period, another movement emerged that did not represent the totality of the Trumpist movement, but that really could only exist within the Trumpist movement, and that was the QAnon movement. And while I agree that it is likely that there are untoward things happening among certain elites politically, as have happened in many societies throughout history, I do not believe that should warrant believing unverified assertions. And I believe that is one of the main problems with the QAnon movement, that it did not make strong enough efforts to verify many assertions that were being made, and people simply were operating on trusting the plan, which I think ended up working quite poorly for them. Nevertheless, my point is that the January 6th event ended up being politically capitalized on by the Democratic Party as well as by neoconservatives in an attempt to separate themselves from Trump. Now, when I say neoconservatives, I don't mean all neoconservatives, as there are still very many neoconservatives that support Trump, and there are neoconservatives that are willing to cooperate with Trumpists. There are neoconservatives that are willing to cooperate with paleoconservatives or even support paleoconservative political candidates. And I'll be getting into that soon. Nevertheless, the collapse or the loss of Trump's presidency opened up the prospect for new leadership in the Republican Party. Because Donald Trump, much more than many previous presidents, made a much stronger effort to have a more direct role in the lower ordering of the party. This was, of course, seen as problematic by both the neocons as well as the paleocons, because both sides are typically opposed to more force of personality type movements, as opposed to the Trumpists, who have a more, you could say, attitude of loyalty towards Trump. And who knows what will happen to them once Trump inevitably either retires or dies, or whatever else could happen. But anyway, getting back to the topic. So, as Trump had left office, Trump was still relatively influential. However, the Democrats began a concerted effort to discredit Trump politically and to attempt to make it impossible for him to run again for office, which I think, I don't know if that is perhaps the best use of their resources, especially considering what has happened more recently in the Republican Party. But that is precisely what I'm about to talk about. So, as Trump had left office, there began a three-way power struggle in the Republican Party. And that is that of the neoconservatives, the Trumpists, and the paleoconservatives. With the paleoconservatives typically being the less vocal, because the paleoconservatives typically team up with the Trumpists against the neoconservatives on things like foreign policy. However, at the same time, the neoconservatives teamed up in the past with the Trumpists to maintain their position within the political establishment. Although by this point, it can be argued that Trump had become so intertwined with the political system within the Republican Party that he had practically become the establishment personified. Not to say that he had adopted the positions of the old establishment, but rather that he had become central to the political structure of the Republican Party. And there were people to the left of him and people to the right of him who saw this as something that could potentially be dangerous to the Republican Party in the long term. Not dangerous in the sense that Trump would destroy the country, except for maybe some of his left-wing critics genuinely believe that. Most paleoconservative opponents of Trump typically viewed it more as something that was delaying the potential of the paleoconservative movement, delaying their potential to come to power, essentially keeping the Republican Party moderate, which is something that they did not want to happen. But nevertheless, this struggle that was emerging, where Trump was being essentially in the central position, being opposed by some neoconservatives and some paleoconservatives, which I think is something that is very frequently overlooked in the way a lot of people like to discuss the Republican Party. people like to discuss the Republican Party as if it is two movements, when it is actually composed of very many movements, and necessarily so currently, for two reasons. One, because it is a big tent party, and two, because it is currently the opposition party to the president, which means that opponents to the president will naturally gravitate to the Republican Party, unless they are too strongly opposed to the establishment of a Republican Party or another major faction of a Republican Party that could oppose the establishment. So, therefore, the arguments people make about the establishment versus Trump, in my opinion, no longer make sense, because Trump has essentially become a new establishment that incorporates some elements of the old establishment through cooperation with the neocons, and also includes some paleocons in the new establishment as well. And therefore, the establishment versus Trump argument doesn't make sense. And it also, in my opinion, didn't make sense as a dichotomy in 2016, because there were many other anti-establishment candidates that the paleocons had put forward back then against Trump. Another argument that doesn't make sense is the position of true Republicans versus rhinos, because, as I mentioned, the Republican Party is a big tent party, and it is not an ideological party, although the Republican Party takes different positions over time. The Republican Party does not have a long-term constitution that declares universal Republican values that need to be conformed to in order for the Republican Party to be the Republican Party. And the Republican Party typically does not kick out people from its party because of their ideology, much to the chagrin of many neocons who would wish that, let's say, Republican alt-righters would be kicked out. But of course, alt-righters also vote for Democrats as well. So it's not as if it's they're married to the Republican Party. Another issue here is that the neocon paleocon dichotomy doesn't work if you are trying to portray Trump as a paleocon, because he simply is not. He does not support paleocon policies, as can be seen in his second term agenda. So the point is that there was a three-way power struggle, and for a time, Trump remained on top of it. For example, in the 2018 election, Trump managed to leverage his force of personality to the point that in Republican primaries, Republican candidates were essentially campaigning on the position that they were pro-Trump and that their opponents weren't pro-Trump enough. And when I saw that, I thought it was so silly, because and I write about this in my book, A Manifesto for American Conservatives, because if you're running for office, you need to be able to articulate your own positions. And if Trump changes his positions, we need to know if you're going to follow him in changing your positions, or if there is some position that you would rather hold. So I would say candidates need to make positive arguments about their own positions rather than trying to ride the coattails of other politicians that are popular at the time. Simply saying, I'm just like Trump, doesn't mean anything if we don't know what you actually stand for. And in fact, if you don't articulate clearly what you do stand for, it could in fact be deceptive, because I would argue that many of these people that ran on a campaign of being pro-Trump. While some of them were Trumpists, Trump loyalists, that is, others were neocons who ended up abandoning Trump after his defeat in 2020. So, in my view, putting a particular personality in the center of a political movement is risky for that reason. And therefore, the argument that many people make that Trump was instrumental in getting very many people elected because of his endorsements and because they were supporters of Trump is, in my view, something that causes a number of problems, not only because of what I just mentioned, but also because if, let's say, you take the perspective, as some do, that these people primarily won because of Trump's endorsement, what you're essentially saying is that the voters chose not to wage the different candidates in the primary on their own merits and instead chose to base it on the opinion of one other person. And I understand that that is something that actually happens, okay? But it is not something that anybody should be bragging about, because it essentially is a sign that the American political system, regardless of whether you think Trump is good or bad, or whether Trump supporters are good or bad, or whether Trump's endorsements are good or bad, regardless of what you think about that, you have to rely on the integrity of the voters to elect good candidates. And if they simply elect them because of an endorsement, that does not show that the voters themselves have integrity. Okay? So that is regardless of the fact of whether the endorsements were good or bad, good or not. And arguably, many people were saying that they were bad. And that brings us to the present. And the present, that is the 2022 election. So in the 2022 election, Trump endorsed a wide variety of candidates, and he made a big show of many of the candidates he endorsed winning. Now, I would say from my observation that some of the candidates he endorsed were typically more moderate, and some of them being Trumpist, some of them being neocons. And of course, that makes sense because he's trying to build a broad coalition. And of course, there were some paleocons in there as well. So he's trying to build a broad coalition, and he's trying to also elect people that are willing to cooperate and people that are willing to work with him, because Trump is expecting to maintain a central position in the Republican Party, and at least so far has expressed his desire to run in the 2024 election, although I do not believe that at the time of this recording he had officially announced it. Nevertheless, it is something that many people consider to be almost certain. However, as this has gone on, the 2022 election has mostly come in. By the time of this recording, it's actually still ongoing. The vote count has been going on for a number of days, and there has not been a full resolution yet. Nevertheless, I will continue to look at what is happening closely. However, as all of these events were going on from 2018 onwards, Ron DeSantis, who had begun his congressional career, I believe, in 2013, having been elected in the 2012 election, having proceeded through the House of Representatives, and in 2015, having become one of the founders of the Freedom Caucus, having been a critic of Trump, in 2017, but later having reconciled to him, had become elected through the 2018 election to be the governor of Florida. So, one thing I want to clarify is that it is true that Trump's endorsements hold a lot of sway, especially with the Trumpists, but also with other Republicans. And of course, many of the Trumpist camp tended to be factions of the paleocons or neocons or independents or sometimes even moderate Democrats before 2016. But anyway, going back to what and that is to say, people that weren't married to the paleoconservative, the neoconservative, or more social democratic positions, people that weren't ideologically married to a position before that. But anyway, going back to what happened, DeSantis, in his years as governor, ended up becoming very popular among Republicans. His disagreement with Trump on, that is to say, not an open disagreement, that is to say, an adversarial disagreement, but an eventual disagreement in the implementation of policy after the coronavirus controversy emerged. His disagreement with Trump pushed his popularity up in a number of different ways because it was seen as more pro-liberty, as opposed to Trump's position, which was in some ways seen as perhaps more pandering to the neoconservative establishment in a number of ways that Trump handled the coronavirus pandemic, where DeSantis was earlier in opening up, and Trump opened up. He actually, I do not believe the federal level opened up until the long after. So, or it might still be closed in some areas. But anyway, the point is that compared to how Trump handled the coronavirus pandemic, a lot of people were saying positive things about DeSantis. Now, it is likely that Trump's position would have softened had he stayed in office, that as DeSantis's position had become more popular, Trump's position would have changed. But as more criticisms were being laid against the way that the coronavirus pandemic was handled in other countries, people began comparing that to the United States and also to how Ron DeSantis handled it. And people were generally saying that Ron DeSantis handled it better than Donald Trump, at least among the paleoconservatives, and even among many Trumpists who considered it as something that Trump needed to perhaps improve his position on. So this, in some ways, exploded DeSantis's popularity to the national stage, as during the Biden administration rolled on, DeSantis very prominently disagreed with many of the things Joe Biden was doing, and openly did things differently than much of the rest of the country, at least much of the rest that was taking advice from the Biden administration. This continued further on, where DeSantis began to take a number of different actions more related to culture, specifically in education, and relating to the transgender movement, where he began to openly be critical of the transition of minors, particularly of medical transition, as well as of the implementation of critical theory, or more accurately, ideas that were based on the premises of critical theory, as obviously in schools, as obviously most children's school books, children age books aren't going to contain detailed Marxist analysis on critical theory. What they are going to contain, however, from authors who take that approach, are extrapolations from this and statements that are made based on that. Statements such as ideas, let's say, regarding whiteness not as a simple ethnic attribute, but as an all-pervasive cultural element that is negative and that cannot be reduced simply through equitable treatment of persons. And when I say equitable, I mean it in the older sense, that is to say, treating people equally, rather than, let's say, trying to equalize people's position. So things like that. Although even then, we're looking at more watered down versions of that. And also, of course, things relating to critical gender theory and critical sex theory and other related extrapolations of critical theory. Nevertheless, this was strongly pushed back by many Democrats, who, especially progressives, who viewed DeSantis as being one of the most prominent threats to their position, especially considering that Trump, although he had spoken out to some extent, ended up taking a more neutral position on those issues and letting the neoconservatives who were more left-wing and the paleoconservatives who were more right-wing on those issues have their own disagreements, rather than taking too strong of a position himself, as opposed to DeSantis, who took a more active role in that issue. So the reason why I'm talking about all these different things DeSantis did is because all these different things ended up greatly increasing his popularity, not only among conservatives in Florida, but also nationwide, as he began being criticized by left-wing news outlets throughout the country, rather than simply locally. And in response, he began to be praised by more conservative positions throughout the country, rather than locally. Typically, DeSantis would be considered as falling within the paleoconservative camp. Now, this is in contrast to some of his more recent characterizations by some of his opponents. As I had mentioned before, many supporters of Trump liked to characterize opponents of Trump through a dichotomy, wherein Trump is the correct Republican position, and then there are the neocons or the establishment or the rhinos who are in between Trump and the Democrats. However, the fact is that the Republican Party has become a multipolar party where there are Trumpists, there are neocons, and there are paleocons. And DeSantis, based on his political record, aligns a lot more with the paleocons, even though he is more willing to take some moderate position when it concerns broader elements of administration. So you could say that he is perhaps somewhere between the hardcore paleocons like Rand Paul and the Trumpist faction, which not the Trumpists themselves, but Donald Trump, who is a more pragmatist when it concerns policies, where Trump is not so much an ideological thinker as he is someone who is concerned with trying to accomplish things, a results oriented thinker who wants to accomplish various things, although because he doesn't take a more ideological perspective, his accomplishments have been strongly criticized by both neocons and paleocons for different reasons. But nevertheless, we now enter into the phase where, as the election was approaching, Donald Trump began to look at DeSantis not as someone that he could ordinarily work with, but as someone who would be a potential rival. This is because many Republicans, some Trumpists, although not very many, but many neocons, as well as many paleocons, considered Trump's loss in 2020 and the subsequent decline of his public presence thereafter to despite the fact that he did continue to hold rallies and he was endorsing people, and his endorsements did carry a lot of weight. They considered it an opportunity to go a new direction. The reason for this is, for one, many paleoconservatives were dissatisfied with Trump as someone who simply was not conservative enough. And this was always bound to happen. Okay, this is not something that was a disagreement that emerged. This is an essential element of Trump's coalition, that Trump made a coalition with people that think very differently from one another, and that in the eventual course of time, when these people begin drifting apart, the compromises that uphold the coalition necessarily fall apart. So the paleoconservatives thought that, not all paleoconservatives, but I would say the most paleoconservatives, as we are now seeing, are thinking that Donald Trump is not conservative enough on a number of his policies. They were dissatisfied with the extent to which the swamp was drained, and they view Ron DeSantis as someone who is a proven politician, who can run on his own merits, and who could potentially achieve greater things than Trump once he gets into office. Another reason why they might oppose Trump is that there could still be resentment over 2016 and 2017, when Donald Trump was more strongly opposed to the paleoconservatives. And not only did he essentially muscle in on an election that they were very confident that they would win, and instead lost because of Trump's involvement, but also his strong criticism against paleoconservative candidates in that time period, as well as some events during his administration, like his criticism of the Freedom Caucus, could have continued to keep a cautious attitude toward Trump by paleoconservatives. And also the fact of the 2020 election could also be another thorn in their eye, as they now see Trump potentially as someone who has kept them from gaining dominance in politics, not for 4 years, but for 8 years. That is to say, 8 years since 2016. That is until the next presidential election, and potentially 4 more years after that if he continues to run. Power which they do not believe that they have held since Ronald Reagan. So they are losing their patience with Trump, one might say. Another element within some paleoconservatives that could lead to some opposition to Trump is simply his age. And I've heard this from foreign observers that Trump's advanced age, uh, as well as Biden's advanced age, are bad signs politically. That Trump is at an age where he is in a position where even if his health is generally good, it could decline rapidly, which is a major issue people have about Joe Biden's neurological health, is that if someone has dementia, dementia can accelerate quite quickly. Now, of course, currently, I don't think there's any significant reason to believe that Donald Trump has dementia of any kind. Nevertheless, his advanced age is something that gives many people pause because they do not believe, perhaps, that he will be able to remain in good health if he returns to office. Nevertheless, there's also the neoconservatives. The neoconservatives also opposed Trump, probably because of his age, although that's probably less of an issue for the neoconservatives because they themselves have many politicians who are advanced in age as well. Another thing that neoconservatives would oppose Trump on is that although Trump's economic policies are generally favorable to the positions of the neoconservatives, his foreign policy is something that they dislike. And also, Trump's perception as the enemy of the establishment means that if Trump continues to be a prominent element of the Republican Party, although paleoconservatives might still be able to come to power, the neoconservatives would likely decline in their popularity due to their association with other neoconservatives who have already left Trump. So, therefore, Trump, who in 2020 had an election where he had no, essentially no paleoconservative challenger within his own party, and there were a couple of neoconservative challengers who, however, had very little traction due to the strength of Trump's coalition, as well as the ability of Trump to hold a strong influence in the Republican Party's internal structure, which led to many states canceling the primary, the Republican presidential primary, that is, making it practically impossible for anyone from within the Republican Party to primary Donald Trump. And of course, therefore, the only paleoconservative opponent for Trump would have been Donald Blankenship, who from the Constitution Party. However, he did not have nearly the degree of support that he would need to be able to beat the Republican nominee. Therefore, Trump's main opponent was Joe Biden. But anyway, going back to the present, there are some who accuse Ron DeSantis of being in bed with the establishment. But if you consider the fact that many paleoconservatives agree with the establishment that Donald Trump is a potentially toxic element within their political party, this should not be seen as something unusual, especially considering that Donald Trump's administration consisted of very many paleoconservatives, as well as neoconservatives working together with Trump, which means that neoconservatives supporting opponents of Trump isn't really much more meaningful than neoconservatives supporting Trump himself, as they did for a number of years. And even so, the majority of neoconservatives in office would likely still support Trump if he won the nomination. There are some neoconservatives who oppose Trump, but it is unlike who oppose Trump and in fact favor the Democrats, and it is unlikely that such neoconservatives would instead support DeSantis, considering that DeSantis's positions are typically more paleoconservative than Trump's own positions, meaning that as a conservative who is more ideologically conservative, Ron DeSantis is unlikely to gain the support of the sort of pro-democratic faction among the neocons, the ones that are falling off the edge of the Republican Party, people like Liz Cheney. That being said, going back to now the official rivalry that is emerging, Donald Trump nevertheless began to see DeSantis as a rival. And you might say, why does Donald Trump consider DeSantis as a rival? It's not only because of his popularity, but also because there are other prominent people that had previously supported Trump that are beginning to support DeSantis. Another important element in this is that DeSantis himself did not say that he would be running for president, although he did not close that possibility. He is known to have a position that he is unwilling to challenge Donald Trump, although time may change that if there is perhaps enough pressure on DeSantis, and if Donald Trump becomes unpopular enough of the candidate that it is likely that somebody else could challenge Donald Trump. It could be that DeSantis himself would enter the race. Now, Donald Trump and DeSantis could not be on the same ticket unless Donald Trump leaves Florida, because DeSantis is the governor of Florida, and therefore it makes sense that he would have to be the resident of Florida, and Donald Trump is also a resident of Florida, and the president and the vice president cannot be from the same party. Another position that some people hold is that Donald Trump should run for one more term, and then DeSantis should run. But this is unlikely to satisfy Trump's paleoconservative opponents, who see him as economically too left-wing, and therefore, as if they could instead have DeSantis, they likely would pick DeSantis. Not necessarily DeSantis himself, but someone else like Rand Paul or Ted Cruz would also be acceptable to these people. So it is not as if there is a new cult of personality that is necessarily forming around Ron DeSantis, but rather that Trump's own personal power to hold together his coalition is declining, which is leading to the different factions of his coalition beginning to make plans for a future without Trump, some of whom are hoping that it comes sooner than later. Nevertheless, DeSantis is not currently someone who has strongly criticized Trump. However, this may change, although the way things currently are going, it might not change. But the main shots fired across the bow in the Trump-DeSantis controversy are coming from Trump currently. Trump began criticizing DeSantis once he began seeing him as a potential challenge to his desired future run for president in 2024. With his most controversial criticism of Trump emerging, or at least the one that is most seen, emerging a few days before the 2022 election, which is something that, of course, in the mind of many paleoconservatives would have been seen as something that is petty and uncalled for due to the proximity to the election, as well as the fact that it is once again Donald Trump engaging in name calling a conservative politician. This leads to an emergence of Trump doubling down on his opposition to DeSantis. The context for him calling Ron DeSantis Ron DeSanctimonious was that Donald Trump was comparing the poll numbers of potential Republican nominees for president in 2024 with Ron DeSantis having 10%. Therefore, Donald Trump was emphasizing that he himself was the front runner according to the poll, and that Ron DeSantis was not quite up there. However, a problem emerges when one considers that Ron DeSantis has not at all actively campaigned for president, whereas Donald Trump has done so for the past 10 years. Well, not 10 years. Let's see. 4, 5, 6, 7 years. But it may soon be 10 if we get there. But anyway, Donald Trump spent the lion's share of the last decade essentially campaigning for president. Even after becoming president, he continued to campaign throughout the country. So it is expected that Donald Trump's chances of being president are higher than DeSantis when it concerns polls, because he has actively campaigned for the position, and he continues to do so, whereas DeSantis has not. Nevertheless, DeSantis did not make any response to Donald Trump, which many considered to be perhaps the best course of action, because doing so would have perhaps played into a dispute between Trump and DeSantis, which would have given a more divided vision of a Republican Party, but also could have given Donald Trump the opportunity to retort and to reduce DeSantis's reputation. However, as things continued, Donald Trump began saying that he had dirt on DeSantis of some form. Now, here's where I begin to really assert my opinion, and I say, if Donald Trump has dirt about DeSantis, why didn't he reveal it before the primary had concluded for governor? Or why didn't Donald Trump release this information as if it is negative information that would defame DeSantis? And if it is true information, would it not be necessary for voters to know such information? Therefore, I do not view this as something to be in good form, because it essentially is an assertion that means that people can imagine whatever they want about DeSantis, that somewhere, somehow, something negative exists, something that could make DeSantis unelectable, but we don't actually know any of what that is. So it is somewhat revealing, I would say, of Trump's character that he would take such an approach, as it is a very frequently used approach by Democratic politicians in less than reputable races. Now, of course, not all Democrats engage in this, but it is something that certainly would reduce the honor of Republicans to engage in such tactics. Now, that being said, this continued with Donald Trump eventually attempting to take credit for DeSantis's political career, despite the fact that DeSantis had a prominent political career before Donald Trump ever went into office. DeSantis having been the founder of the Freedom Caucus a year, or actually more than a year, before Donald Trump entered office, therefore having, as a conservative, a degree of seniority over Trump when it concerns his political career. This is not to say that Donald Trump is wrong to say that his influence increased DeSantis's chance of winning due to an endorsement. However, to say that Donald Trump's endorsement was necessary for the re-election is to essentially detract from Ron DeSantis's own accomplishments in office. Also, to say that his endorsement was necessary for the first election is to impugn against the voters, because it essentially implies that the voters themselves could not be sufficient judges of character and judges of the quality of candidates in order to ascertain which is the superior candidate. That being said, I'm not disagreeing that this is the case, because it is somewhat embarrassing, but when discussing American politics, but it is true that there are a lot of low information voters, not just among the Democrats, but also among the Republicans, who don't do their due diligence. And that therefore, I believe that there need to be major electoral reforms, not of the kind that I think Trump could possibly suggest, but ones that would have to more radically rearrange the way elections are run in the United States, and perhaps even the structure of our representative system. But I discuss some of that in my book, Manifesto for American Conservatives, that the current path we're on, it doesn't seem like people really have a solution to this problem. And I believe that this is a problem caused by the alienation of politicians from the voters. That is to say, that the voters are less able to hold politicians accountable because the politicians are more distant to the voters, because the electorate is growing, and the way that districts are organized doesn't accommodate for that. And obviously, we wouldn't want to have a potentially infinite number of representatives in Congress, because that would mean that eventually Congress could not function. But at the same time, we don't want to have a potentially infinite number of constituents in a constituency because of the problem that I just mentioned. So essentially, in the early 20th century, the US government decided to fix the number of representatives to a certain level and to just never expand beyond that. And I would say that this has led to a decline in the quality of American politics since then. Just in the same way that the reforms of the Electoral College in the 1820s led to a decline in the average quality of presidents since then. As before that, electors would have to be more individually elected, and rather than people voting for the president whose party would then appoint electors to vote on their behalf for the president, which means that nowadays all 50 states involve the political parties as an essential element of their presidential electoral system, which, if you read the Federalist Papers, that itself is a major corruption. And surprising how early it happened in American history. And of course, it was done by the states rather than the federal government. So that's another issue that would need to be looking at. But going back to the issue of representation, if you read the Federalist Papers, what you see is an analysis of the potential of larger and smaller constituencies And the conclusion that the Federalists come upon is that constituencies should have, at the most, membership in the tens of thousands. But nowadays they have membership in the hundreds of thousands. And of course, that's not counting statewide elections, which mean constituencies in the millions, which essentially leads to a decline in accountability, because if the voters are not able to effectively communicate with the candidates, and when I say effectively communicate, I mean being able to talk person to person and get to know the candidate, which is not possible when you have constituencies in the size of hundreds of thousands, but it is possible when you get to the tens of thousands, where practically everyone who would want to meet the candidate could meet the candidate, as there are likely many people who simply don't have an interest in being that directly involved in politics. However, this would allow for a greater degree of accountability. However, the political system has long since departed that, and I don't see anyone in Trump's camp offering a solution. That's not to say that anyone among the paleoconservatives is offering a solution either, as there are many of them that are too married to the way that the Constitution currently operates, that they would see a restructuring of the representative system as something a bit too radical of a change. But perhaps that's me. Maybe I'm too radical. But anyway, back on track. My opinion on Trump versus DeSantis. I typically agree with the paleoconservatives on a lot of policies. I personally considered Trump's second term agenda to be too left wing for me. And I think that his age alone is enough to have of an argument as to why he should retire from running for president and perhaps take a more advisory role in government, or perhaps something where he would thrive with his skill set, such as a lot of people had positive things to say about Trump's foreign policy. So maybe he could be Secretary of State, perhaps Secretary of Commerce, perhaps somewhere else, or White House Chief of Staff. Although no, that's busy work. Probably not for Trump. Trump likes managerial work. He doesn't like busy work of that kind, though. Nevertheless, he could be an official advisor to the president, or he could run for Congress, as John Quincy Adams had a successful career in Congress after having been president. A wide variety of things could happen. But my point is that, as I have said before in my video where I talked about my more detailed opinion on Trump, I don't hate Trump, okay? I think that the Republican Party should move in a more paleoconservative direction. And I think that it would be good for the future of the party, because I am in agreement that a lot of Trump's picks were too moderate. In my own region, I noticed that more moderates were winning the primaries because of Trump's endorsements, as opposed to more paleoconservative candidates. And of course, as someone who leans towards the paleoconservative position, that certainly is something that rubs me the wrong way. So I don't think Trump should leave politics entirely, because he is still very influential, for better or for worse. And he could leverage that influence to do a lot of good things. But I do think that he should not become the commander-in-chief simply based on his age alone. And I don't enjoy the policies that he supports on an economic level. And I don't think that he did enough significant change in the government to have a strong enough long-term impact. So I think I personally have a positive, an optimistic perspective of DeSantis, but that's not to say that I'm married to the position. If DeSantis proves himself to be much poorer of a candidate, I obviously wouldn't support him. Or if he shows that perhaps he's not suited to be president, perhaps I would prefer him to then return to be governor. But based on what DeSantis has done, I am very confident about him. And I would say that many of his opponents who like to disparage him by pointing out that he has been being supported by various people, Donald Trump himself also was being supported by various people, as were various members of his administration and various other politicians. The question of support is not a question of, is this person receiving support? It's a question of, what are they doing in result of this support? Or more accurately, is this support what is guiding the policies, or are the policies what are guiding the support? Because, okay, this guilt of association game is a game that is also played by Trump's opponents. Trump's opponents who like to talk about Trump's association with neoconservatives in his administration, like John Bolton, for example. Trump's opponents from the Democrats who like to say that various untoward people have endorsed Trump. For example, David Duke. And of course, I'm sure very many conservatives aren't very approving of David Duke. But people like Richard Spencer, who in 2016 was supportive of Trump, but I think in 2020 he supported Biden. So, see, it's something that goes both ways, because the reason why people support each other aren't always linked to full support. Okay, because a lot of Trumpists have some vague idea of loyalty that I can't seem to really philosophically see the justification of, where they say you need to be loyal to Trump, and DeSantis is being disloyal. Well, first of all, DeSantis isn't taking any active action against Trump. People might point out the raid on Mar-a-Lago, but that was a federal raid. That wasn't something that DeSantis had jurisdiction over. Because, believe it or not, the US government has jurisdiction over all of the United States. And that means that they can conduct investigations all over the United States. And of course, law enforcement throughout the United States cooperates with federal law enforcement. And if something was legitimate in a certain sense, it doesn't mean that it is illegitimate in a different sense. So, going on to the Mar-a-Lago raid, a lot of people oversimplify the issue as if DeSantis had some strong right to stop everything that would have happened there, even though he didn't, because of the way law enforcement works in the country. Now, you might not like that, and perhaps there are reforms to be had there, okay? And that's something that's good to look at, is potential reforms. And of course, and this is going back to the question of support, because there are different reasons why politicians support each other. So just like the neoconservatives in the Trump coalition didn't support Trump because they liked all of his policies, the neoconservatives supported Trump because Trump was willing to work with them on some issues. He was willing to compromise with them on some issues. And he was willing to throw them a bone by giving them positions in his administration. And also because, despite what some people might say about them, neocons actually want the country to prosper. Okay? As do paleocons. They just have different ideas on what makes the country prosper and on what methods are acceptable to promote prosperity in the country. So there's that. And so when we're talking about DeSantis and his supporters, we should take the same scrutiny that we take about Trump and his supporters, because Trump isn't supported by everyone for the same reasons, just like DeSantis isn't supported by everyone for the same reasons. The reason why neoconservatives might be beginning to gather behind DeSantis, who is more leaning towards the paleoconservative position, is possibly because they see Trump as old hat, as someone who is past his chance, especially considering the 2022 election that Republicans were generally optimistic about, but that they ended up not performing too well in. That is to say that they made some gains, but they did not make as many gains as they were hoping for. And Donald Trump likes to take a lot of credit for the wins of candidates that he nominated, but at the same time, there were some high-profile losses, like Dr. Oz against Fetterman. Fetterman, by many Republicans, having been considered an easy opponent to win over. However, the argument is that because Donald Trump chose to nominate someone who was too moderate, it did not energize the Republican base enough to really push enough of them to support Dr. Oz. Therefore, the election did not end up in a victory. And of course, you can blame Trump to some extent for making ill-advised endorsements, but at the same time, it all goes back to the voters as well. Ultimately, the voters decide who is nominated, and the voters themselves in the primary seem to have had perhaps poor judgment. Now, that's not to say that another candidate in the primary would have won. However, the impression is that there would have at least been a different dynamic to the race, which could have changed the outcome. But once again, it's important to not overstress Trump's involvement here, as the victories and losses are due to a wide variety of issues. It could be that conservatives might not have had enough enthusiasm for some of the candidates that Trump endorsed, as is certainly the case for some conservatives. It could also be that there was an error in the election, hopefully not deliberate. When I'm saying the election, I'm not talking about the Oz election. I'm talking about different elections, okay? Because that is a various elections. There are accusations, but once again, I'm not going to get into that, as I don't think it's the scope of this video to determine whether all of these things happened or not, because ultimately what matters is who ends up sitting in office. And in the case of 2020, that was not Trump. So you could say the winner is the one who rules. The winners write the history books, and you can you can try to reform things further down the line, but we'll see what happens. Hopefully we'll get some good reforms through, because a lot of people pointed to Florida and saw it as a very strong election. So anyway, my point regarding the relationship between DeSantis and his supporters and Trump and his supporters is that it's more important to look at what the candidates are doing themselves than in what other people are saying about them, because their actions should speak louder than their words. And it is unfortunate that a lot of people are taking excessive positions on here, where people are saying that Trump is the worst person ever, which is not true. People are saying that he's the best person ever, which is also not true. People are saying that DeSantis is the only one that could make it in 2024, which is not true. However, I do fall into the position that the Republicans should put someone who is more conservative than Trump. But we'll see how that ends up going. So anyway, thank you all for watching. Please tell me what you think in the comment section below. This has been going on for quite a long time, but if you want to have more detailed views on conservatism, ideologically, philosophically, with references to the founding fathers, as well as looking into things that various conservatives have said throughout American history, as well as relating to conservatives throughout broader history and in other cultures, I would recommend you read my book, A Manifesto for American Conservatives. And I thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Wiltus Over and Out.